Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing discussion of Vietnam. In the last several lectures, we talked about the deepening war in Vietnam, the abyss, as I've called it. In this lecture, we're going to talk more specifically about the combat experience for soldiers on both sides, before turning in future lectures to the great turning point engagement of the war, the Tet Offensive. From the American perspective, it still might be difficult for some to understand how an army of relatively lightly armed soldiers, including the very young, the very old, women and men, was able to defeat the most heavily armed force in the world, the U.S. Army. And yet, there are many factors that ultimately favored the Vietcong and North Vietnamese over American troops. First, we need to talk a little bit about the organization of the American Army. And we need to understand that at the height of this war, the draft was incredibly important. Not only was a large portion of the American Army drafted, but it was also very influential in the decision-making of those who may not have been drafted, but volunteered. First, let's note that the peacetime draft was implemented all the way back in 1940, as World War II was setting in Europe. This was the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940, signed by FDR. During the Korean War, the Selective Service began the process of offering deferments for college students, a practice that continued in the era of the Vietnam conflict. We should also note that since war was never officially declared in Vietnam, it remained technically a peacetime draft throughout the years of the war. In fact, more than 1.4 million men were drafted in the years before the serious escalation in Vietnam, between 1954 and 64. As the war deepened, between 1964 and 73, 2.2 million men were drafted. The draft becomes incredibly important, and we'll talk more about it when we discuss the anti-war movement a bit later in the course. But let's note a few more details. First, less than 10% of those eligible to be drafted during these peak years of the war were actually drafted, 2.2 million out of roughly 27 million in the pool. But it came to feel for some like everyone was being drafted. The vagaries of the draft lottery left some communities feeling especially hard hit, and every American, it seemed, knew someone who was drafted. Second, the military force in combat zones never exceeded 25% draftees. That is, 75% or more in combat were volunteers or professional soldiers. But the draft was a strong, compelling force in the country, and millions of young men felt compelled to volunteer, as it offered a greater chance of choosing their fate. The fact that they volunteered does not necessarily mean they were cheerful and willing participants in the war. The Pentagon estimated that as many as one-third of volunteers did so because they were concerned about the draft. What does it mean that so many American soldiers were drafted or volunteered under duress? We'll talk shortly about the motivation of the soldiers, but it certainly means that many soldiers did not fully buy into the missions they were assigned. They were scared, out of their comfort zone, and just trying to survive. Some were openly opposed to the very war they were fighting, and in some rare and extreme instances, they engaged in open rebellion against their commanding officers or fellow soldiers. This took its most extreme form in the practice of fragging, the killing of an officer. We'll talk more about all of these issues later in the course. Soldiers were drafted for a 2-year term, which meant 12 months in combat, with the other months dedicated to training and transport. The 12-month combat tour also was a long-standing tradition, going all the way back to the Korean War. General Westmoreland, commander of the U.S. forces in Vietnam, explained the 12-month tour. The harsh conditions provided one of the strongest arguments for a 1-year tour of duty, he later wrote in his autobiography. The 1-year tour gave a man a goal. That was good for morale. Another general described it this way. He said the boost of individual morale that this policy gave warranted and merited the one-year policy. Soldiers need something to look forward to. I think it's just part of human nature. At the end of the war, Lyndon Johnson said, "The one-year tour was adopted primarily so that the hazards of combat might be shared by more than just a limited number of people." As one study summarized it, the one-year rotation policy satisfied not only the general sense of fairness, but also appealed to the American public, concerned as they were with minimizing the danger to their own sons. The tour for American senior officers was 19 months, but for junior officers only 6 months. There was also some rationale for these shorter tours for junior officers. For one, it offered more opportunity for officers to gain experience. From the broader perspective of the U.S. military, the more important engagement was World War III against the Soviets, and they wanted as many experienced officers as they could. And of course, no one knew how protracted this war was going to become. The short tours made sense for a war that would be over in a year or two, but as it dragged out to 6 and 7 years, the constant churn in leadership caused real problems. While there were some sound reasons for these relatively short tours of duty, many experts point to the quick rotation as one of the reasons for American failure in the war. Soldiers perpetually seemed to be in one of two states of mind: utterly green, inexperienced, and terrified, or counting the days until they could go home, and thus less interested in supporting the overall mission. Lieutenant Colonel David Holmes, writing in Military Review a few years after the war, stated, "The short tour policy undoubtedly contributed to the instances of mutiny, corruption, drug abuse, and fragging." The constant churn in soldiers led to frustration and sometimes breakdowns in discipline. The most extreme cases involved fragging, the killing or injuring of an officer, usually by detonating a fragmentation grenade, hence the name. There were some 700 cases of fragging documented between 1969 and 71, the most harrowing years of the war. It also contributed to illicit drug use. Marijuana, opium, morphine, and heroin were in wide use by the peak years of the war, and it's estimated that 80% or more of soldiers were casual or habitual drug users. The short terms for officers created even more problems. These officers scarcely had a chance to learn the system before they rotated off and were replaced. For soldiers beneath them, the constant stream of new faces meant little incentive to respect the officers. Many of them were greener than the soldiers were. For the officers themselves, the 6-month stint often became just a career hurdle to be survived on their way up the promotion ladder. If the soldiers had little motivation, sometimes officers had even less. One study recounts a junior officer explaining to his new replacement, "I could have been a hero. Sometimes I even wanted to be. But I had to think of my family, you see? Most of these boys don't have any family. They're just boys." That officer spent 6 months in the war simply trying to avoid combat and just survive. The broader war aims of the U.S. government were irrelevant. As one expert described it, not only did the rotation policy foreclose the possibility of developing a sense of unit integrity and responsibility, but it also ensured a continuing supply of low-quality, inexperienced officers at the point of greatest stress in any army, namely its combat units. This was a very difficult war for both sides, but particularly for American soldiers unaccustomed to the conditions. They were supposed to be there helping the South Vietnamese army, but found the South Vietnamese soldiers to have little morale or determination. Their opponents, on the other hand, fought fiercely, even when tremendously outmanned and outgunned. The enemy was incredibly mobile. They traveled light and moved around very easily and quickly. The Americans, by contrast, were slow. Movements were cumbersome. They brought great firepower to the conflict, but took much time to implement it. American discipline was generally good, but that often meant they waited for orders when fired upon. How should we respond? And often it was too late by the time a response came. It was also very difficult to locate the enemy. They lived in the same villages as the South Vietnamese, and in fact, they were the South Vietnamese. They looked just like them. Old women and children participated in the fight, so your enemies could appear innocent. They blended in perfectly, and of course, there was no open sign that they were actually the enemy. They also had vast networks of tunnels and very secure defenses, many of which were never found and destroyed by American forces. Conditions were horrible for the American soldiers. The heat, humidity, and rain were completely new to these arrivals from the United States. Many soldiers went down because of problems with their feet, foot rot, or various other ailments. Dehydration was common. They were constantly afflicted with bugs, mosquitoes, snakes, and so on. It was a very frustrating war to fight. They rarely saw the enemy out in the open. There were large numbers of casualties from landmines and booby traps called pangy traps, or punji traps. These often involved sharpened wood spikes, usually dipped in feces or urine or something else to poison them. There were lots of primitive, Rambo-like devices, wooden stakes, and so on. And so many American soldiers became casualties without ever openly engaging the enemy in a fight, which created incredible frustration. The Americans confronted several different kinds of enemy forces. On the one hand, there was the North Vietnamese Army, the NVA. These were North Vietnamese Army regulars, such as what you see pictured here. They were generally outfitted well. They had consistent uniforms, consistent weapons, a high degree of discipline and training and experience. Then there was the Vietcong. These were armed forces in the South, but they generally were fighting from underground. They lived in the villages amidst the peasants. They still received training, but their weaponry was less consistent, and their supplies were less consistent. We'll talk more about them in just a moment. And then there were others who might simply be described as peasants or volunteers. They weren't necessarily active members of the Viet Cong, but they assisted when and where they could. In some cases, women in the villages might be openly working in the fields or working in the villages during the day, but at night they might be sharpening stakes for the punji traps or some other devices. Similarly, small children might just go about their business during the day, but help the Viet Cong in the evening and at night. So the Americans had an array of different opponents in this war, and different battles they encountered different elements of these units. The members of the North Vietnamese Army were powerfully motivated, very skilled and experienced troops. Let's consider one case study, just to give you an idea of what these forces might have looked like. Vo Minh Triet was born in South Vietnam to a family of farmers. This was during the era of the French occupation. He grew up hating the French colonial powers ruling his country. In 1945, when he was just 15 years old, Triet joined the resistance when Ho Chi Minh declared independence. Over the next decade, he fought actively in the Viet Minh against the French forces. Triet was out of the active service between 1956 and 61, but rejoined in 1961 at the age of 30, as he determined more resistance was needed, now against the Americans. Triet marched south along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, some 600 miles, taking a couple of months, and on some days eating only 20 kernels of corn along the way. By July of 1961, he had actively rejoined the Viet Cong in the south and would join the war against the Americans. While powerfully motivated and experienced, the Vietnamese soldiers also endured many hardships and deprivation. From 1961 to 1975, Triet never once slept in a bed. He often went many days without food. His days were often spent marching or running through the jungles and the tunnels. Like many of his soldiers, Triet was incredibly slight. One of his fellow soldiers, after going out on a battlefield after a battle against the Americans, returned to say, "What we saw made us shudder, because we saw how small we were compared to them, as small as one of their thighs." While Vietcong and North Vietnamese Army troops both relied on their extensive experience from the previous war with France, Vietcong forces in the South were often trained less consistently. There were more than 50 Vietcong training bases across South Vietnam, but in some cases, the troops were not able to attain the training openly. Others volunteered with little to no training or experience, and as I've mentioned, some of them were peasants and civilians, teenagers, young boys, or women and mothers and grandmothers who might have had little training. There was also little standard equipment for the Viet Cong troops in the South. They had to find what was available to them. As I've mentioned in previous lectures, they scrounged for Chinese-made weapons, Japanese or French rifles left behind, Soviet weapons that might have been available, and as I've mentioned, American weapons and other supplies that might have been dropped, left, or lost. In general, the Viet Cong soldiers were lightly armed, which made them highly mobile. As you see in the picture here, they might carry just a small bag with them, including a handful of rice or some kernels of corn and a small amount of ammunition. This made them incredibly mobile and quick, in contrast to the American troops, who typically carried large packs and all kinds of stuff that clattered around as they moved through the jungles. The Viet Cong forces would travel often underground through a vast array of tunnels. There were more than 100 miles of tunnels in and around the city of Saigon alone, and thousands of miles throughout the countryside. Parts of these underground tunnels became massive stations for headquarters, barracks, munition dumps, hospitals, and kitchens. As I've said, many times the Vietnamese forces were not even visible to the Americans because they were underground. Their specialty was guerrilla warfare, coming out from the tunnels and surprising American forces and then sneaking back into the jungle or into the tunnels where they were undetected. As I've mentioned as well, the Viet Cong had the sympathies of South Vietnamese peasants and villagers, who often helped them in their efforts, digging holes or traps, the punji traps with spikes, or sometimes just a hole that they would conceal. Countless American troops were lost to a wrenched ankle or a spike going through their foot. Landmines as well, which were often assembled using the artillery from Americans that was unexploded, and they would use the explosive content from those artillery shells and make landmines, which then took out American forces. On the whole, the American troops confronted an enemy that was far superior to their expectations, and one of the great flaws in American strategy throughout the war is that they consistently underestimated their enemy. In the next lecture, we'll return to discussion of the combat and the most important turning point in the war, the Tet Offensive